Mr. Richard Ford.
Thank you, Johanna. And as you said, I've got the pleasure of moderating and hosting our panel today. And panels are a great way for us to bring experts up so we can ask them questions. I've obviously got some questions, but I will encourage you to also ask questions, put them on the spot. In preparation for this, we laid down some ground rules that we want it to be combative. We don't want just complete agreement across the panel, so we'll see how we go. And if we are getting agreement, please jump in with some questions to try and provoke that difference of opinion. So we're talking about threat and exposure visibility. And as we've touched on throughout the day, gaining visibility of threats and visibility of our exposure is key, and is such a hot topic at the moment in cybersecurity, and one that's growing. In fact, actually, one of my colleagues pointed out to me, Brian, who you heard from earlier, that if you look at Gartner's hype cycle, which tracks how relative and when technologies and solution areas are going to really become mass market, the vast majority of technologies, services, and solutions that are being developed and are being hyped up to be the next great thing are all around threat and exposure management, threat and exposure visibility. So it's something that is very much a hot topic for us. And actually, if we look at vulnerabilities, if we look at last year versus the year before, the number of vulnerabilities is growing all the time. Last year, we had a year-on-year growth of 20%, so an extra 5,000 vulnerabilities that have been added to the vulnerability database, or the NVD, that we need to respond to and react to. So the vulnerabilities are constantly growing, so we need to have that exposure, the understanding of that exposure. And that's obviously been fueled by the changes to the IT landscape that we touched upon, and we will get down into again in this session. I think one of the things that we've seen, and definitely that I've seen, is that organizations have failed to keep pace, or they're struggling to keep pace with the ferocious increase in vulnerabilities and exposure overall. And actually that applies to organizations of all sizes. And from my experience, and I normally sit on the panel rather than host, so I'm going to have to try and not answer all the questions and make it all about me for once. But yeah, from my engagement with customers, particularly the larger customers, it becomes a much larger problem to be able to deal with. So I'm hoping that we're going to touch upon each one of these areas in the panel, and we can get the views of our experts. So without further ado, I'd like to bring them to the stage. So first, I'd like to welcome back Martin Johansson, that's just been on, so as our systems engineer from Fortinet. We also have Ellis Reed from Integrity 360, who is a solutions architect. Welcome, Ellis. And then lastly, but definitely not least, we've got Magnus Johansson, Senior Solutions Engineer at Rapid7. So I've strategically placed Ellis in the middle so he can moderate between our two competing vendors. Thank you. So where I'd like to start, really, we're talking about threats, we're talking about exposure, but actually threats is the first word out of there. So I was wondering if we can start with, what do you see? And actually, so I'm going to come to you first, Magnus. And what do we see and what do you see when engaging with customers, particularly in the Nordics, that is the main threats that they are concerned about? And actually also, if you can bring that to, how has that changed over time?
So I've been in the market for a long time now, but I think I've been with Rapid7 now for 6 years, and I think in the beginning it was very much on the vulnerability side, a lot of vulnerabilities. I talked about it during my talk as well, but I think it's shifting a little bit more to, I think customers are understanding now that it's more from on a risk-based side. You can't patch everything. You can't have a perfect solution scenario. We're supposed to kind of compete now, I know, but I mean I'm totally with you with the fact that we will never be 100% secure. So I think what we're going in more and more now, I think it's managing the risk. I think that's the most important. Vulnerabilities are still very important, but it's also a lot of threat actors out there.
Okay. And Martin, I wonder if you could expand upon that, and in terms of what you're saying, and particularly in terms of those key threats that that you're seeing from particularly from a Nordics perspective.
Yeah, sure. I do agree with Magnus. Unfortunately, I wish I wasn't.
That's not how we planned it.
No, but I mean, also coming from a vulnerability perspective, but what I think we face and have faced for a long time is the credentials phishing and the ransomware attacks. And this is from a broad and general perspective. I mean, from different verticals and different organizations, there's of course different priorities. But if I'm gonna generalize, I would say ransomware attacks. And an interesting key aspect to that is if you monitor the price of Bitcoin, you can also monitor an increase in the ransomware attacks because it's more lucrative to attack when the price is high and less lucrative when the price is low. So if you're scared of ransomware, you monitor the Bitcoin market. That's it.
Maybe that explains the dwell time and how it varies from time to time.
Yeah, absolutely.
Brilliant. So Ellis, I'll just come to you, and same question, but I suppose it'd be great to bring in your view from UK and Ireland. What the top threats and things that organisations are concerned about.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, obviously, ransomware, malware is still a big topic. We're seeing a lot of phishing, becoming more sophisticated in the way that they're delivering those sort of attack paths. Also, we're seeing things around cloud as well. So cloud's becoming quite a large threat vector because obviously people are moving workloads, moving a lot of compute up to cloud, and they're overexposed in those areas. Maybe it's a lack of skill, maybe it's an accelerated timeline that they're having to do this under. But again, that's sort of opening up that attack surface and that threat vector to unknown variables. We were very safe when we had sort of vulnerabilities within our networks, within our on-premise environments, but as we're escalating towards a compute sort of central aspect, we're becoming more aware of threats within code, threats with over-permissive access into cloud infrastructure that's really leading sort of problems or more modern problems around cloud exposure.
Yeah, I suppose that is something that we see a lot as organisations. I did say I wasn't going to try and answer questions, but organisations, it's just too tempting. But organisations that are now moving to that, cloud first onto cloud only, now actually getting that entirely new area, and that's something we'll come on to in a second. So we got ransomware, phishing, which I think is a key part of ransomware. Magnus, you called out some of the vulnerabilities, and I think quite often we get lost in these headline-grabbing ransomware, zero-day vulnerabilities. But actually, when we start looking at some of the reports, we see things, stats like 60% of ransomware is through poor cyber hygiene. Brian was talking earlier about 99% of cloud breaches being down to misconfigurations. Do you think we give too much emphasis on those headline-grabbing things? And actually, is the problem just poor cyber hygiene? Magnus, I don't know if you want to come in on that.
No, I mean, I must just say that the cloud part is, of course, super important. And vulnerability is not only on-prem, but also in the cloud. And I think the configuration and thing is definitely something that we are, specifically at Rapid7, we are looking into quite a lot. But I don't think you have any... I don't think I have any interesting to add to that question.
I think with the zero-day thing, look, it's important. It's important to understand the zero-day threats. It's understanding that, but how often are those actually the first exploit that people are doing? A lot of the time when zero-day comes out, they tend to be quite complex attack paths potentially, and people are still exploiting older vulnerabilities. And I guess it's having visibility of these sort of vulnerabilities and prioritizing those correctly that really is the problem. You've got a platform or system which, is a legacy way of operating, legacy way of thought process where you sit there and go, I've got 40, 50,000 vulnerabilities sat there flashing at me. What's another one? Or what's another 10? Not providing the necessary prioritization around those vulnerabilities that are really hurting us. So look, 0 days are really important, really to get visibility and start looking through your estate and understanding, well, am I affected by this 0 day, but what is the impact on that and how does that drive risk within the business? But equally, you find that people aren't really focused in those areas. It's normally, we'll just add that as an update to our current vulnerability management platform, and it just gets lost in all that noise.
Yeah, that is...
Many of the new vulnerabilities, just like I said, they're based on old stuff, right? There's a new vulnerability out on the market, but once they get a foothold in your environment, they will still use their old stuff.
Yeah. Do people have the skills, right? Do people have the skills to then look at those vulnerabilities holistically within their environment and go, I understand that attack path, I understand what they're doing, I can reverse engineer that sort of the pattern, and I know how to protect against it. If you've got 10,000 servers with a 0 day vulnerability, well, how do I prioritize my limited workforce to go out and then start remediating that? That's another thing, is how quickly can you react to that 0 day, even though you might know about the impact. So again, it's the skills within cyber that really limit that sort of response function as well.
Yeah, actually, I suppose there's two, very important points there. And you touched upon old vulnerabilities. I think there's 85% of vulnerabilities that is in a report that were exploited in 2021 were actually well over 2 years old. So there is that big fuss on 0 day, what's new, but actually we're probably not doing the work to resolve.
But the 0 day is the one that the CEO will talk to you about, or CTO as well.
The 0 days are more fun to talk about, and that's why the news are reporting on them as well. But I do agree that a basic cyber hygiene is more important than just chasing the 0 day exploits. Because of course, if you're a bank or a military government or something, you should care about 0 days because they will be targeted. Just looking at the price some APT groups are willing to pay for an unknown 0 day exploits are in the millions dollars range. So it's not like they're going to buy that one and target the kiosk on the corner of your company. They're going to target the big corporations. So a basic cyber hygiene is more important than chasing big headline 0 day vulnerabilities for sure.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And actually, that's probably a nice segue into kind of the next topic, which is how do we zero in on what really matters to us? And I'll probably start with you just because we're going to come straight off the back of your talk that you've just done on, which was looking at sort of the external attack surface. But I think we can start zeroing on what's important to us in this area. It's the realm of threat exposure management. And for me, I like things in threes. So 3 is the magic number, and I'd probably break that down into the attack surface, understanding the attack surface. Then how do we go and discover and remediate vulnerabilities, then how do we validate our exposure? So if we start with sort of the attack surface, and for the non-Swedish speaking, that in case you have already covered it, it'd be great to get your view on what do we really mean by the attack surface broadly, beyond just the external. What is it that we need to be caring about?
So in my talk, I talked mostly about the external aspect of the attack surface, but I mean, from an attack surface perspective, everything in an organization is basically an attack surface. Your users, your machines, your credentials, your applications, your systems, your network, everything is basically an attack surface. So we talked a lot about visibility in this event, and I think that's the key topic here. What you don't see and what you don't know, you can't protect, and that comes down to every aspect of your organization. It doesn't really matter if it's an exposed service, because they might use that exposed service as a jumping board into your organization, and then use your vulnerable applications or printers or misconfigured firewalls to gain lateral movement, to then reach their end goal, which might be IP or credentials. So everything is an attack surface, and again, I guess what I'm landing in is visibility in all aspects is crucial.
Yeah, it's trying to draw the prioritization around that attack surface as well. So, if there's something incredibly complex that's really difficult to attack, but it's sat on a very closed area of the network, then is that more important than something that is very easy to attack, but it sits on the external facing side of things? And again, some attackers don't care about staying silent. That's not the objective, that's not the goal. All they need to do is stay ahead of the people that are trying to stop them. So again, if you don't have the right controls in the right elements, even though you understand your attack surface, you might not be able to put defensive measures in place, because all I've got to do is stay ahead of your blue team. All I've got to do is make sure that I'm ahead of you, because if I'm trying to get hold of data, information, or anything like that, as long as I can sort of pivot through the network quite quickly and have the agility there, because I might be leveraging multiple vulnerabilities. Even though you might have the probes in place or visibility in place, you still need to have the level of granular control that allows you to stop that from happening, or that action from occurring.
Indeed. And sorry.
Yeah. So I think to add to that, we have a lot of people are looking at vulnerabilities from an external threat, but many of them are not doing like authenticated scans. They're not really checking what you can find on those assets. I think that's an important vector. They have full control of what they have on the internal network, but not on the external network.
Yeah, they'll do the breadth testing.
Yeah,
exactly. It exists, but actually can it be exploited? How deep can they go? And what happens if they exploit it? What can they do?
Classic.
That drives the priority up.
Yeah, classic is no, we are scanning our external network, and this is how the attacker sees it.
Yeah, they're always coming from outside in.
You can check
never
with
inside.
Måns. He will probably say something else, like he will see a little bit more than what standard tools will do. But then you have when they have reached, if you kind of breach the network and come on your inside, then you need to have tools, of course. Like I discussed during my talk, we have be able to refine them in the different stages of attack, so you can kind of stop them on the way, and that is important to have those kind of tools in place.
I want to add one aspect to that as well, and one of the things that I talk a lot with customers about is OT security. We have a lot of customers that are what we see from the in general terms, we see is that the IT and the OT sphere, they're converging. So we need more and more access and visibility into the data that's been generated in the OT networks, which means they're not air-gapped anymore. But then talking about the vulnerabilities that we see, it's not like you go out and you patch a CM's PLC on a Friday.
You don't scan them either.
No, you don't even scan them. So how you work with vulnerabilities, touching upon what you both said, is more important than just knowing the vulnerabilities there. You need to have a method of prioritization of how critical the systems is, and
business context and the risk
exactly,
side, right?
Yeah. So and working with, there is multiple different tools you can use, both tools based on like Rapid7 and also processes that you can implement that are available. So.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's very true about the IoT and OT. Many of the manufacturers have gone long out of business, so there isn't going to ever be any patches to be able to patch those. So, there's alternative strategies that you need to think about there. And actually, your point about knowing the vulnerabilities further, I suppose we're quite guilty in the security industry of doing the anatomy of attack, and once they've gone through the initial exploitation, then they're acting like a normal user. So it's easy to forget about those vulnerabilities further in. But actually, as Patrick and others, and I'm sure Måns as well as a pen tester will attest, it's not, the next step may always be, exploiting that vulnerability. So that's extremely important. So I mean, just before we kind of wrap up on, attack surface management, I guess what we didn't talk about, we talked about it broadly, but what are the tools that we can put in place to help us understand our attack surface? Magnus, I don't know if you want to start us on that.
Yeah, sure. We can have tools for detecting VIPs, detecting darknet activity. I think we're both offering that from Fortinet and Rapid7. Not going into any brand names or anything, but or product names, sorry. But and then of course. During my talk, I talk about an XDR, which I think is super important. I talked to one of the ladies here in the audience, and she said, everyone's got an EDR. I was like, no, you would think so, but not everyone's got that. And then last thing I would say is, of course, a real vulnerability management solution. Not just a scanner, like very important, not just a scanner finding vulnerabilities, giving you 600-page Excel sheet, because no one will do anything with it. You need to have something that you talked about regarding the prioritization. Prioritization not only through what kind of vulnerability it is, but also a business context. Like this is a very important machine. This is the server renting out, bicycles, not as important as your domain controller.
Yeah.
And then you can get a remediation path on what to do, and not only the Excel sheet.
Yeah, and it's also looking at the cloud exposure, right? When you're looking at cloud workload protection,
Definitely.
Cloud security posture management, when we start looking at vulnerabilities, again, we're guilty of going, well, it's an operating system vulnerability that we're looking at here. Expanding that sort of attack surface, going, right, well, actually, there could be a vulnerability in code, that stops us from doing this. How do we feed that into our pipeline? How do we code that out of the problem? If it's a workload issue, ultimately, if somebody is poisoning our workloads, or if somebody is able to get into our, Kubernetes or Docker containers, again, there could be vulnerabilities in the way that you've blueprinted or architectured, that element of it. And again, you've got to get visibility of that, and holistically bringing it all together. Because again, it drives up the priority stack. It could be, right, our application's got a vulnerability in it. So we have to code that out, but the application actually sits on a legacy operating system. There could be multiple vulnerabilities there that actually, somebody can just exploit one thing in that environment, and then they can actually move, or they could take advantage of that. So holistically, we've got a better view of that. We're then able to do that. And the only way you're going to do that is gaining visibility by having the right security controls and the right tools in the right places to give you that full breadth of visibility to go, I understand what we need to do. I understand how we prioritize it. And I've got an asset database of whether it be code, whether it be operating systems, everything. So then I can make educated decisions around prioritization, but also on remediation. You know, when I want to, do something, how do we remediate that? And also something that we'll touch on is, looking at the incident response plan. You might ultimately have these tools in place, but if you've got no plan of who I'm going to talk to, when do I talk to them, when do we initiate this, the confusion and people tripping over their feet trying to remediate quickly because something's going on can also cause confusion. So it needs to be quite a well-oiled machine in order to, from start to finish, to understand what are our engagement processes, how do we smoothly remediate these, so when we start getting indicators that something's been compromised or someone's in our environment, we can deploy these very, very quickly and very efficiently.
Well, John, actually, so you've very nicely, as if we've planned this, taken us into the next part, which is really talk about vulnerability management. So, Martin, I might come to yourself and just, we kind of talked about that stat of 60% of ransomware actually down to exploitable vulnerabilities, and a huge amount of old vulnerabilities are there, and we see that from our IR team generally. We look at the example that Patrick gave earlier around Log4j being within that VMware Horizons platform. It's been there for a long time, so but not being patched. It seems that although vulnerability management definitely isn't new, it's definitely something that we're not getting right because the breaches occur over and over again. So where do you think that we're going wrong with vulnerability management?
For me, it's two aspects. The one is having the correct tools to prioritize, and the other one's processes, basically. Because as Magnus said many times, it's overwhelming. There's an overwhelming amount of vulnerabilities, and we really need to have the correct processes and tools to prioritize, and that's where I think people are going wrong. They follow the news, they see what's being written, and they look at that specific scenario, but they miss the big picture of prioritizing based on application risk or exposure, or if the system's critical or not. So, and then have the processes in place so that the system owners, or if it's maybe it's not even a service that you have control of yourself, maybe it's a third party that's hosting that service. You need to have processes in place so that you can tell them to do their work, because if they're not patching it for you in a timely manner and you tell them to, you have to have that process in place to follow up and monitor, so to make sure that all your supply chains and third party that provide you services are also being patched. So I think it's a combination of tools and processes.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people make the mistake that it's a security team that's solely invested or are solely responsible for those sorts of remediations. Ultimately it's a business-wide problem. And other teams need to be brought into that ecosystem to basically contribute and collaborate and continue to do that. And also, you're continually assessing those processes as well. So this isn't a set and forget world where, we set it up, on it goes, and it's just going to continually do it, automate, remediate itself. Automate where you can, but ultimately all of the departments that are responsible for this visibility and vulnerability project need to be brought in and collaborate in order to successfully pull this together.
You can have remediation projects for the intern doing patching on a couple of laptops or whatever, but then you have you mentioned Log4j or Log4Shell vulnerability. Came out on a Friday. Was everyone in the company like, okay, so how do we do this? It took 24 hours before we had some kind of vulnerability check for it, but then it was super advanced to get, and that's I must say to the VMware version there during the previous talk where they couldn't find that vulnerability. Log4Shell is super hard to find. Like it's not an easy vulnerability just saying, okay, this register key is not in the system or something. There's I think we have 5 different ways of finding Log4Shell in different versions, and it's kind of an advanced one, and it took us to get like full coverage. I think it took a week or something because different ways of finding it. So some of these vulnerabilities are super hard to find.
Yeah, John, that probably validates what I want to say in terms of and it's all about compensating controls because. And here we go, I'm answering the question again. But compensating controls in place because, in that example, it wasn't known that Log4j was there. It was well hidden inside, but actually some simple testing of that would have identified it. But actually, I suppose we need to think one step further on and take that approach. We may not find it. We may not ever do the testing to find it, but we need to look at what happens afterwards and understand that exploit. So and I kind of want to bring it back to the last piece really on vulnerability management is to really look at how has the cloud and how has hybrid working really affected our approach to vulnerability management. What are the significant challenges there? And Ellis, I wonder if I can just come to you on that one.
Yeah, so the challenges there is that we've widened our attack surface and it can become very dynamic. So where we might have static hardware and we might be able to contain on-premise or a network, when we start utilizing cloud services, it becomes a bit of an unknown and we lose an aspect of visibility in that space. And also, I think that a lot of people have been skilling up on that. You have your developers and your network, aspects around the cloud infrastructure that they are aware of that, they are aware of how to develop and deploy, but really in terms of how to deploy securely and set up secure blueprints that give aspects and visibility into those elements, and also create guide rails, for good standards and good hygiene within these practices that are probably lacking. Again, over permissive access into cloud has been a big problem, and that is a vulnerability because people will leverage that and use that against you. Opening up, S3 buckets or repositories that you don't know that people have access to. So it does touch on a lot of different areas. I know we talk about vulnerabilities, we talk about ransomware, malware, but vulnerabilities can exist in all different types of aspects within cloud infrastructure, cloud estate, and ensuring that you've got visibility and control over that and you're performing it in a dynamic manner is probably quite key because, again, I could have wide administrative access into a cloud estate, spin up what I want when I want. Well, should I have that access? Should I be doing that? Or am I just exposing more sort of vulnerable aspects of that environment? And also what you find typically is, it's an easy route into your critical assets and your crown jewels. And a lot of people don't have visibility there.
Yeah. So, and Martin, is that based on what Ellis has said, would it be true to say that we need to look beyond CV numbers?
For sure, and I think also we need to look beyond. We talk a lot about vulnerabilities right now, but there's so many aspects to being vulnerable. There's a Swedish famous event where someone connected an internet cable into a network area storage, which was basically what they did. It took the wrong cable from a switch, was the WAN link, and plugged it into the NAS. And then there were public records of health talks being available on the internet. So there's the human aspect and there's the misconfiguration aspect that are also vulnerabilities that are not based on a CV or a known bug in a program. So when we're talking about cybersecurity and cybersecurity hygiene, we need to also broaden it to not just look at vulnerabilities, but look at all aspects, training the staff, talking about configuration management, and making the life for our IT staff as easy as possible to mitigate those risks. I think that's important.
On the cloud part, like plugging the cables in, it sounds like super easy mistake to do, but now in a cloud environment, it's just a line of code. That's wrong, right? So that's definitely something that we need to look into cloud-wise. Like you need to do that. Talking about vulnerabilities in the cloud, we have tools where you actually take images of a specific asset and just checking whether there are vulnerabilities. That's another aspect of that is that servers in the cloud. It's not like you said. It's a racked one-use server. We're talking about a server that's actually living for maybe 5 minutes, living for 1 hour. What should we do with it? Should we actually patch that one? Most likely, we would probably just kill it. So it's a little bit different thinking when you have a vulnerability in the cloud as well.
Yeah, because it's so easy to spin stuff up. Also, stuff gets left.
Yes,
exactly. We don't have asset databases. We don't understand what we've got deployed. Yeah. A lot of problems that I see in the world is, how many servers do you have? How much do you have within your cloud infrastructure? And people are like, I don't know. Development are spinning stuff up in prod, pre-prod development areas. We have no idea and no sanction, no control over it. So it becomes very complex very, very quickly to be able to identify that.
Also the repositories that the development are using that are not in your control. You're calling on repositories that are available or open source on GitHub, which you can just use, but you have no control on what type of code is in them. You kind of rely on the good faith of the public to monitor the code and report if there's suspicious in it, but there's no, if you don't integrate it into your CI/CD pipelines, you don't have control over what you put into your application. So
developers have no guide rails onto what they're allowed or not allowed to do in terms of repositories. Yeah, so you could be introducing vulnerabilities that you by accident. Right, and it's typical way of it's like a misconfiguration, but ultimately it's one of those things that you're like, well, you know, and also what about in terms of when you actually have code out there in the wild and a new vulnerability is released? How do you feed that back into your pipeline to then rectify that, you know, for the next release to ensure that you're always releasing a clean image? You know, your gold standard is always changing. But then that also means that your risk profile is always changing. You know, one day, you know, I might have very low risk because ultimately, you know I have control of my inventory, I understand my risks and where they sit. As soon as you introduce a cloud, you introduce dynamic risk. And therefore, introducing dynamic risk means that one day you may be compliant, the next day you may be very uncompliant. So again, that's a challenge that I'm seeing quite a lot.
And a nice segue to what I was thinking about was the compliance side. I think it's super important to have tools to look at the compliance side on in the cloud, because there's so many. It's so easy to just spin up a whole environment using infrastructure as code. Like you talked about in your talk, you talked about credit card. Like you just need a credit card and you're up and running and have full environment in a matter of seconds or minutes, depending on what it is. But I think that's it's important to think what you have in the cloud and also have tools to find what you have in the cloud.
Yeah, I think shadow IT is definitely a growing and existing and growing problem. So just I guess the last piece on that threat exposure management, magic 3 areas that I described was sort of exposure validation. So Magnus, I might come to you first, and just we see tools like breach and attack simulation and just pen test as a service, attack path management, and others coming, starting to grow a bit of and gain a bit of traction in the market. But if we're managing our attack surface well, do we need to worry about doing all of the validation on the back end?
Not to step on Måns's shoes here, or whatever you call it, toes. Sorry. I think it's very important. I think it's very important that you have control of your vulnerabilities. But like I also said during my demo over there, that most of you out here, and I'm not pointing any fingers, that you probably have too many vulnerabilities to actually start looking at validating whether they are actually vulnerable. I think most customers out there, and don't get me wrong, not everyone, but most customers out there should probably check their vulnerabilities first rather than starting to validate them. But I'm definitely with Måns doing pen test once a year. It's super important because there's no tools in the world that can fix what a live pen testing team like Måns's team is doing. That's my opinion.
I think when you start validating them, you start validating sort of the vulnerabilities that are within your ecosystem. It then helps drive prioritization, because ultimately, if there is a exploit that is incredibly difficult to, ultimately perform, and depending where it sits, it can help prioritize that based.
Yeah, definitely, we have that I'm thinking now from Rapid7 point of view. We do have prioritization automatically in the tools saying that this is a very easy exploit, and I always say go for them first, of course, right?
Yeah, it drives focus, doesn't it? Because ultimately I want to get the low-hanging fruit first, but ultimately the things that are sitting, or there is a segue into my critical assets, what that might be is, so I want to patch everything around my critical assets first. I want to make sure that I'm on point with that. And if I'm validating all of those vulnerabilities, I'm going, right, yes, these exploits can actually be done. These can be, exploited, and they can get access to those critical parts of my infrastructure, wherever that sits, or my critical data. Then ultimately, if I'm patching and remediating those as a priority, when you look at the old school way of doing things, I've got 40,000 vulnerabilities. Well, out of that 40,000 vulnerabilities, even if I've got visibility, even if I deploy the right tools, if I can't prioritize what those vulnerabilities mean, I'm not able to then successfully protect what is most important to my business, which are my critical assets, which are going to cause, ICO fines, which is going to cause a lot of reputational damage. So what I want to do is close those pincer points at the moment, or those lateral movement points, because those are laterally giving access into my critical assets. So I know out of 40,000 vulnerabilities is statewide, these 10 need to be patched or remediated or fixed immediately, and it drives them up the list. And so you go, I've got clear vision on where we need to patch. And if that becomes dynamic, because your environment's dynamic, your patching schedule becomes dynamic, but that is all driven around risk and priority, around making sure that the thing that's most important to the business, those critical assets, are protected.
Brilliant. Now, I've got another page and a half of questions, and I think the four of us could carry on chatting here for at least a good hour beyond. But as promised, I did want to sort of bring in the audience and see if there's any questions for the audience that that you'd like to engage our panel of experts on, particularly around threat and exposure visibility. Yep, we've got a question there.
Now we are a bunch of IT professionals here, and we're talking about tools and processes. If I, as a company, had X amount of money and time, where would you recommend me investing that? In more tools and processes, or in educating my hundreds or thousands of IT illiterate employees?
Can I answer it?
Yeah, go for it.
I would do an assessment first. I would try and understand where we are as a company and what are our security priorities. I wouldn't just jump into any specific key topic without understanding where I am in my security maturity journey. So first you need to understand, where am I the most vulnerable? And perhaps you're right, perhaps the most vulnerable aspect of your business is to educate your IT illiterate staff, and that's the way you should go. But do your homework.
I can also add to that. I think it depends. I mean, I agree with you to have like a review, but there are a couple of things that is pretty good to have. Firewall is a good thing to have. So if you don't have that, start with that. And Fortinet
Preferably
has a good one.
FortiGate.
Yeah, exactly. I would probably go for a good XDR and also vulnerability management solution. Those are the three things that are kind of pops up. And then if you have cloud environment, obviously you need to have some kind of posture management tool for that.
I think education is key as well with user education. You know, it is easy to send out user education. You know, it's always the squishy thing that, you know, tends to let us down, whether it be a misconfiguration or a vulnerability that has accidentally occurred. You know, so I think it's a valid point. You know, you can do things that are very low cost in order to be able to increase your security posture. Education is great. Understanding, you know, doing simulated phishing exercises to see if somebody is going to click on a link and give it back. And then you can focus your efforts on maybe the repeat offenders, the ones that like to click links, or, you know, get the Amazon gift cards, or enter all your credentials and we'll give a free toaster to you. But, you know, so those are things as well. But yeah, without that, and also getting buy-in from the business, right? That it's a strategy, it's a mindset, it's a change, it's a shift. You know, just putting it on security, I find, always means that there's people running around with their hands on fire, and, you know, everyone needs to be bought into the strategy and understand it from board down. You know, it is important for education.
And I'll have a go at answering it as well. Why not? So I think I just touched upon that education piece because, you know, I think a lot of security awareness is a waste of money and a waste of time because it doesn't actually improve things. I think if you're going to spend the money, I'd spend it educating the senior leadership team on what the security behaviors and culture is needed across the business, and then build that in. If you look at how oil rigs, you know, and the oil industry reacted in disasters, they changed everything they did into what are the behaviors we need, so that we have a culture in the organization where we understand it, and we can call each other out and hold people accountable. And that's what's going to make the big difference to your security posture from a human perspective. So that is all we've got time for. Actually, we are over time, and I'm probably going to be rushed off the stage any minute. So I just want to say thank you very much to our panelists for joining me on stage, and I hope that was useful and insightful. And if you want to hear the rest of the questions, please grab us during the drinks at the end. So I will get out of the way between us, all of us, and the coffee break from here. But thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.